Ian Lochead. I'm sure you could have come and represented an organisation and given yourself 10 minutes, but...
Well, thank you for the 5. I'm really representing myself, but my engagement with the Provincial Council buildings goes back to 1981 when I was made the City Council's representative on the Canterbury Provincial Council's building board before the various changes to the administration of the buildings. I'm sure I don't need to remind councillors that this is one of New Zealand's most significant heritage buildings, and it's an internationally significant example of Gothic Revival architecture. But what I want to emphasise is that the timber sections of the building along Armagh Street and Durham Street and the 2 towers are work that can be commenced almost straight away. The design work is complete, the engineering work is complete, it just needs the funding to be made available, and the expectation was that that was going to happen. I think it's really important that we get on, particularly with those timber sections, because the longer those buildings sit closed up, the more deterioration that will occur. It's not that they haven't been stabilised and made watertight, it's just the damp, the cold, the lack of air circulating through the building is going to cause deterioration. According to the press several years ago, and the details are in my written submission, there was 35 million of insurance money for the provincial buildings, and it would be unthinkable if the around 30 million that should still be available after the stabilisation work is not spent on those buildings. Additionally, there's 2.5 million in the Prime Minister's fund that has been sitting there for some considerable time. I would suggest that the only way to make sure that that money actually comes to the buildings is to get on with the work, because my investigations with the Ministry of Culture and Heritage suggest that they're really keen to have that fund wound up. But what I want to stress is that doing work on this section of the buildings will actually facilitate the fundraising for the rest of the buildings. The new convention centre is right across from the Provincial Council buildings. I think it's critical that this part of the project is completed in sync with the convention centre, because we simply don't know who the big international funders for the more difficult phase on the Stone Chamber, on the Bellamy's, are going to come from. And I think we want to create a situation where every visitor to the convention centre has the potential to visit the Provincial Council buildings. This may seem pie in the sky in terms of a building that is undergoing restoration, but this is something that is increasingly being done internationally with heritage buildings that are being restored. The National Trust in the UK has just committed to the restoration of Clarendon Park that was completely gutted by fire 2 years ago, and they have stated that they're going to have it open to visitors right throughout the restoration project. If the National Trust can do it, I'm sure Christchurch can do it as well. And so, in essence, I think it's really important for the health of that timber section of the buildings to get on with that work, to put the funding into next year's budget, or the coming year's budget, I should say, so that we've got a platform to work from in terms of generating funding for the completion of the Stone Chamber and the Bellamy's.
I will make one comment. I mean, you're absolutely right about how much the complex was insured for. But whether you can say that that is what we got for it, given that we had a global settlement, they're slightly different things. We did receive the grant from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage and the Canterbury Earthquake Fund, and that money is sitting available. One of the things that I've been exploring is the nature of the ownership, because as you mentioned, it is a nationally significant building. It is the only provincial council chambers left in the entire country. So that makes it a nationally significant building. It sits on DOC land, Department of Conservation land. So we don't own the land, we're responsible for the building due to statute, but it is it's a provincial building with national status. So, and I always felt that from a fundraising point of view, because there is additional funding required, that it would be better if we could get it into some form of trust that would enable them to fundraise for it. So that's something that I've been exploring, but it does require an amendment to the Act. That is something I've spoken to both the Heritage New Zealand and I've mentioned it to the government, and it's just early stages. But you're quite right that its location to the convention centre is what creates an opportunity, but also the need for some impetus. But every time a private sector developer gets involved with, or a private sector or a trust is developing, the costs of development are much lower than they are for a council. And I haven't quite worked out why that continues to happen, but it does. It's almost as if there's a local government or central government top-up that gets added to every tender that ever goes out. So I want to be able to spend as much on that building because it's precious, not just locally but nationally as well.
Well, thank you. I think it would be really invaluable if a trust was to take the buildings on, to actually have a platform to work from,
yes,
to be able to get people into the buildings. And I think if you deal with the timber sections, that would give the trust a position to move forward from, rather than setting them up with what I think would seem an almost impossible task.
Yeah, but as I say, it requires a statutory response. But as I say, we've got a new minister for Christchurch, Greater Christchurch regeneration, and it might be something that we can get on the table. So thank you very much for your submission. It is a precious part of our history.
Thank you.